if we put together this morning session and my talk, we see two sides of Gendlin's amazing genius, at once reflective and praxeological, and how they complement and hopefully supplement each other. We heard this morning moving testimony of the directly experiential, and now I, as a philosopher, will weigh in with thoughts that are explicitly reflective and philosophical in origin. And that reflects the fact that Jean and I knew each other in philosophical worlds and circles and talked to each other about philosophical issues almost exclusively. Only Gendlin himself could maintain the tension between these two directions and pursue them both with comparable finesse and skill and insight. But we're here to work and think and experience in the wake of that double-sided genius. To understand how Eugene Gendlin came up with his revolutionary proposal of felt sense, we must remember the milieu out of which his breakthrough was born. This was the behaviorism of the time. On the behaviorist paradigm, human action and interaction were a matter of contingent and external forces proceeding by way of efficient causation, in Aristotle's term, for that which precipitates a result by means of sheer impingement. That is, one thing up against another, as when I am conditioned in one of the telling terms of the time to do something by virtue of the sheer repetition of a causal influence that bears down upon me from the outside, say from my being subjected to corporeal punishment for missteps I may have taken as a child. I am brought to task for my miscreant behavior by these corrective means, typically something measured in exact units of time and space. My parents used to say, "Go to your room for 2 hours." The spatio-temporal quantification was meant to induce in the acting up child a determinate result, better behavior, behavior befitting the paradigm of what it is to be a well-behaved child. Determinate patterns are discerned at every step, from my misbehavior to the punishment to the pattern of so-called correct behavior. Now, the setting for such thinking is what Gendlin calls environment number one, the world viewed as a set of interacting efficient causes. This is a measurable and thus a manageable world in which predictability and thus controllability are key features. Here, every discrete phenomenon acts on another discrete phenomenon and is in turn itself acted upon, back and forth, one thing up against another, moving from one causal nexus to another. Everything in such a world possesses what Whitehead calls a simple location. That is, a position that can be pinpointed in determinate and presumably reliable ways. Any description is done from the standpoint of someone exterior to the phenomenon being described. It is a spectatorial scene, all of which is viewed from a third-person point of view. But what if the world as we actually undergo it is otherwise? Dilthey and Husserl had proposed, even before the advent of Watsonian behaviorism, that this very different world is the world that we actually experience. And the young Jean Gendlin, as a student at the University of Chicago in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was taken by this emerging paradigm. It became the basis for his eventual notion of what he calls environment number two, as set forth in the process model. That is, the environment understood as anything and everything that, in his words, participates in a living process. Now, this sense of environment is closely related to environment number three, which is where environment number two takes place, its own or proper place. Environments 2 plus 3 constitute a closely concatenated, compounded milieu in which the obsessive search for efficient causal generation is replaced by an inherent and ongoing sensory awareness and life process. They make up what Husserl came to call the life world, or Heidegger being in the world. Here, a personal aside. Mentioning these final meanings of environment reminds me of the conversations that Gene and I held on this very topic in his New York apartment on the West Side. He had just moved to New York from Chicago and craved discussion of his ideas at an early stage of a process model. These intense talks, held about once every 2 weeks, continued for almost a year. Mary Hendricks would join us toward the end of each such occasion, offering shrewd insights of her own. It was thus a special pleasure for me to have been, many years later, instrumental in facilitating the publication of a process model published by Northwestern University Press in 2018, with a foreword by Robert Parker. Even if Gene himself did not live to see the published book itself, sadly, nevertheless, it did finally emerge. So, to resume my initial thread, by turning to environments number 2 plus number 3, Gene Gendlin was able to offer a crucial alternative to the reigning behaviorist models of his student days. Thrusting aside, or at least holding at arm's length, the behaviorist conditioning models of human experience, in which everything was external to everything else, spectator to phenomenon, cause to effect, part to part, one thing to another, one person to the next. In place of all this, he devised what I would like to call an immanentist, immanentist schema of experience. On such a model, what matters most occurs in and is an integral part of ongoing experience, rather than being external or transcendent to it. Gene first fully broached this immanentist approach to experience in his early book, Experiencing and the Creation of Meaning. Bob Scharf and I both remember when, as graduate students at Northwestern University, this book first appeared in 1962, and the owner of the local Evanston bookstore, Truman Metzel, brandished it before us and proclaimed it to be, in his word, revolutionary. Well, history was to prove Truman right. This book, based on Gendlin's dissertation at the University of Chicago, put immanence on the agenda of postmodern Western thought, a move that was to be followed by Deleuze and Guattari in their 1980 book, A Thousand Plateaus, in which they single out what they call the plane of immanence. I see Gene Gendlin as having been the first to envision this important stratum, dimension of our human experience. What was unique about Gendlin's early contribution was his insistence that the most important thing that must be regarded as immanent to experience is meaning. By this, he did not mean the detached meaning that is at stake in separately definable concepts, whether as Platonic forms, Aristotelian essences, or as Kantian concepts of the understanding, but rather meaning as it is fully operative in human experience. That is, that gives meaning to this experience, allowing it to make sense immediately and not as the result of any inductive or deductive process, or by any process of stepwise inferential thinking. Rather, the process is in the experience. The process is in the experience. Indeed, it is the experience, an experience that is inherently sensical or senseful. Thus, we can say, indeed, we must say, that experience is meaningful and is never not so.